Morning, church. It is good to be back with you once again. Although I must admit, it does feel a little surreal to be back in front of people and not in front of a screen. It is lovely. I was talking to Pastor Josh yesterday, actually, and we were talking a little bit about digital burnout. I don't know if any of you have experienced a little bit of that during our several lockdowns that we've had so far. But I think that idea of kind of getting a little bit sick and tired of Zoom is something that we've all a little experienced over the last while. It's good to be back in front of people, and it's good to be able to participate together. Your rights, that's a bit of an abrupt little statement, but I want to ask two questions of you this morning, rhetorical questions. If you feel like shouting out, that's fine as well. We're all friends here. But I want to ask two questions. The very first one is, do you know your rights? Your civic rights, your rights as a citizen of New Zealand. Now, I must admit, that's not really something that I think about very often. It kind of feels like a little bit of a stereotypical American thing to be concerned with rights and privileges, but the fact remains that as a citizen or as a resident of New Zealand, you have certain unalienable rights under the Human Rights Act. And I wanted to share a little bit about that this morning. So the first question I want to ask is, do you know your rights? If you don't, here they are. This is according to the Human Rights Act of 1993. Human rights, here's what they say, are the basic rights and freedoms all of us are entitled to, no matter our age, no matter our ethnicity, our culture, our religion, or our sex. Okay? This is directly from the website. And it says here, I know that it's a little bit small to read, but it says the Human Rights Act protects you, people in New Zealand, from discrimination. That's the big key word. Unlawful discrimination is when you're treated unfairly or less favourably than another person because of your fill in the blank. I won't say all of them, but this is the list. In other words, as a person living in New Zealand, the law prohibits any person, entity, organization, or anything else from discriminating against you based on these things here, which the Human Rights Act deems as something you cannot control. It's outside of your control. That is what they say. All right. And again, you can go on the website and check this out some more if you want to. Today's message is not about the Human Rights Act, but I think it's salient for our conversation that we will have. It continues by saying, the Act includes areas of public life where it's unlawful to discriminate against anyone. You cannot, as a resident of New Zealand, be denied access to the following things: government services, education, public places, employment, housing, or accommodation. Now, the big word, as I mentioned, in the Human Rights Act is this word, discrimination. And it's an interesting word when you think about it. This idea of discrimination is actually something we all do, right? If you were to define discrimination, there are a couple of different definitions, but one of them is something that we all do. Discrimination is simply when you choose one thing over another, when you determine a preference based on who you are, what you like, and what you believe. If I was to discriminate when I walked into a bakery, I would choose the lemon slice over the white chocolate brownie. Why? I don't like white chocolate. Am I discriminating against white chocolate? Absolutely I am, but that's my right. The problem, or the sort of murky area, is when we show discrimination to people for factors outside of their control. So, what is the Human Rights Act trying to accomplish? Well, I think in a nutshell, it's fairness, right? The aim is that you and I, regardless of who we are guaranteed fair and equal opportunity to work, worship, and life. Is everybody happy with that? Do you think that's a good definition? Yeah. It's a fairly bland definition, but I think it encompasses what the Human Rights Act is trying to accomplish. And you might be wondering what my point is, so here's the bottom line. If you and I do not understand our rights, you and I cannot participate in a safe and equitable society. If we don't understand what our rights are, and if we don't understand what the rights of other people are, then we cannot properly participate in a fair and equitable society. It's important to understand your rights, but perhaps it's even more important to understand the rights of other people, because that is what gets us into trouble sometimes. We understand what our rights are, but sometimes we don't quite understand what the rights of other people are. Now, my second question is a little more tricky. Do you know what your rights are as a Christian? As a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, as a Baptist, as a whatever, as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, do you understand your rights? Now, nobody's going to read them out to you. If a police officer pulls you over, he's not going to read your Christian rights. There is no Christian Rights Act on a website somewhere that states the inalienable rights that you have as a follower of Jesus. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And the conversation on rights and privileges gets murky, as in the rights and privileges of us as New Zealanders. It gets murky when it intersects with our lived Christian experience. For many of us, the rights that people in our country enjoy sometimes feel like a conflict with our Christian ideals and values. And I know that we're sitting here and we're thinking about our rights and we're thinking about the rights other people enjoy. So I thought I would just name some of them. These are some of the issues that divide us, not just as Christians, but as a country. There are many other issues here. I mean, we recently had a referendum on marijuana and using drugs. But these are some of the issues that divide us as people, that divide us as Christians. And if we were to do an honest survey of the room, I don't doubt that each one of us would have some very strong thoughts and opinions on many of the topics on this chart, right? These are important issues. And the fact remains that there are rights and privileges that our country gives to people living in New Zealand that are given to people living in the US, in Australia, in the Western world, that as Christians, sometimes we have issues with. Would that be fair to say? Yeah. We are not a theocracy. We are not a country that is guided by the principles of the Bible. In many ways, influenced by the principles of the Bible, but we are not a theocracy. Now, as it pertains to this issue this question that I asked you, do you know your rights as a Christian? I'd like to rephrase it. And I think this is probably the real tension point for many of us. What do I do as a Christian when someone else exercising their rights feels like an attack on mine? Or perhaps you could rephrase it, what do I do when somebody exercising their rights feels like an attack on my values or what I believe? Because on one hand, as Christians, we put a very high value on freedom of choice. If you don't know, as Seventh-day Adventists, we fall into a particular camp that is opposed to another camp. There are two very basic streams of thought within salvation. What happens? How does Jesus save us? There are some Christians that believe that you are predestined to be saved. There's nothing that you can do about whether Jesus chooses to redeem and save you or not. But as Seventh-day Adventists, we believe that it is your choice, that Jesus gives you that choice and that he will not take that away from you. Whatever you choose, that is your choice and he will honor it right now and also eternally. So as Seventh-day Adventist Christians, we put a very high value on choice, right? We ultimately say it is you, the individual's decision about how you want to live your life according to your values, according to your conscience, right? And that is true. But on the other hand, there are so many issues on the screen that we just saw before, and others that are accepted or supported but by our government, by our societal structures, that we as Christians fundamentally disagree with or have issues with how it's been implemented. And this creates an obvious tension that can be difficult to navigate as Christians. And this is a salient, I think, discussion for the times that we live in right now, but this always comes up. There are always issues within our society that we as Christians feel like we have a say in, but sometimes it feels like we're being, I guess, disregarded. We're being left out of the discussion. So how do we deal with it? And this is a little bit wordy, but here's how I have worded it. How can we as Christians maintain a God-honoring position towards issues where we differ from mainstream culture, whilst at the same time not compromising on our mandate to love our neighbor? And I think this, even though it's a little bit wordy, probably sums up how I think about this. Because on the one hand, I don't want to compromise what I believe is true and what God is leading me towards in terms of the serious issues. But I'm also very much aware that in the process, I am tempted to compromise on my mandate, and it is a mandate, to love my neighbor as myself. And so what happens when my neighbor, whether they are literally my neighbor, next door to me, whether they are my co-worker, whether they are my family member, starts to believe or to practice things contrary to what I believe is right and true and what the biblical story is leading me towards? How can I maintain a God-honoring position toward issues where I differ from mainstream culture, whilst at the same time not compromising my mandate to love my neighbor? It almost seems a little too difficult to accomplish, but I do believe there is a way. And I want to invite you, if you have a Bible, to turn with me to the book of 1 Corinthians. And I'll give you a little bit of a preamble. Many of us are familiar with the historical context, but in case you're not, I'll talk about it a little bit. We find ourselves in the year AD 50, and we find ourselves in the city of Corinth, the ancient Greek city of Corinth. Corinth itself was named after an ancient Greek city-state that was ruled by a variety of rulers and tyrants throughout history. It was an ally to Sparta during the Peloponnesian and Persian Wars, but was destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC. 100 years later, in about 50 BC, it was rebuilt by the Romans, who must have figured out that it was probably a bad idea. And they made it the capital of this region in Achaia. It was the capital of their region. And when Paul arrived about 150 years later, the city had grown from being rebuilt from the ashes to a thriving, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-spiritual, multi-religious sort of metropolis. You can read about Paul's founding of the church at Corinth in Acts chapter 18, but our story takes place about 4 years after this, after the church has been founded, and Paul is on his merry way. As you may know, Paul was a church planter. He would go into a region for a time. He would peddle his tent craft. He would preach in the local square. He would find believers, and then he would found a church. He would help grow that church, and then he would leave to the next place. So we are coming into this about 4 years after Paul's founding of the church at Corinth. And he is in Ephesus at the time. And as he's in Ephesus, he gets word about some disturbing developments in the church at Corinth. And to address these issues, he writes the first letter to the Corinthians, otherwise known as 1 Corinthians. And today we're going to read from part of that letter. And we're going to be going to chapter 8. So 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 9. And there are a whole raft of different issues that Paul is delving into in this particular letter, but we're going to focus on one that seems possibly a little bit inconsequential to us. Culturally, we are far, far enough away from this particular issue that it just seems a little bit pointless, but there is a point in it. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, he's addressing one of the issues, one of the many issues in the church. In particular, in Corinth, at the time, food, as it was grown and harvested, was often given to the temples, the various different temples in Corinth, as a sacrifice to the pagan deities. But if the temple had any leftover food, they would often just sell it at market. And so if you were a person going into the market in Corinth to buy food, sometimes you would not be able to know what food had previously been offered as a sacrifice and which food had just came straight from the farmer's field. And so this had caused a little bit of a problem in the church, because a lot of the Christians who had previously been part of this whole temple sacrifice system had now become Christians. They now put their trust in Jesus, and they were wondering, well, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to act around food that has been offered to these pagan gods, these Greek gods, the Roman gods, whatever other gods were floating around? Now, this is a complicated issue for the ancient Corinthians, because you would not usually know what food was offered to an idol and which one wasn't. Sometimes you could ask, has this food come from the temple? And you had to hope that whatever hawker was selling it tells the truth. But it was further complicated by the fact that if you went to somebody's home for food and they served you a meal, how were you to know where the food was coming from? And some of these early Christians were really having issues with this idea of, well, has the food been tainted by the pagan gods? Am I supposed to eat it? Is it fine? Or is it a real issue for me? So as you can kind of imagine, though we are far removed from this issue, it was a highly contentious thing. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, starting in verse 4, here is where Paul starts. He says, "So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. But not everyone possesses this knowledge. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat sacrificial food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to a god. And since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. But food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do." It's a fascinating discussion that he has here. And you can see his logic from the very beginning. He's clearly setting out his sort of theology of there's only one God. There is only one God, and we believe there's only one Father. He is the one who created everything, and he is the one who sustains everything. Therefore, any other God that might be out there is merely human creation. It doesn't actually exist. It's not real. And therefore, any food offered to any other God or Lord, well, it doesn't really matter. But then there's that nuance that he gets into at the end there, right? Whilst Paul recognizes that any food offered to a God makes it no worse or no better, he also recognizes that not everyone sees it that way. He continues, verse 9, "Be careful, however, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone with a weak conscience sees you, with all your knowledge, eating in an idol's temple, won't that person be emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother or sister for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge." Pretty harsh. When you sin against them in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat that meat again, so that I will not cause them to fall. It's a fascinating discussion, because what Paul is doing here is he is redefining the boundaries of sin. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, one of the things that the questions that I often had was, well, what is a sin? Is this a sin? Is that a sin? Is it a sin to tell a white lie? Is it a sin to do this? Is it a sin to do that? Trying to figure out where the boundaries of sin actually is, so that I can push the boundaries but not go over them. And what Paul is doing here is he is saying, actually what we need to do is rethink the boundaries of sin altogether and not be so set in stone about what sin is and what sin is not, that we think that one size fits all. He says, look, I know that all these gods, all these lords, they aren't real. They are fake. They don't mean anything. So if I was to offer any food, if somebody else was to offer food, it doesn't matter, because I don't believe they're real. Therefore, the food is not defiled in any way, shape, or form. But I also recognize that not everybody thinks that way. That some people are so fresh from the sacrificial system that to them, it's still a big deal. So if I was to cause somebody else to fall into sin, what they think of as sin, because I have all this freedom, I have all this knowledge, I'm superior, in a way, to them, yet if I cause them to sin in their mind, with me utilizing my rights, my freedom, my knowledge, well then it may as well be sin. It may as well be. He's saying that even if yours and my conscience is completely clear, if I use my freedom, if I use my knowledge to propel a brother or a sister to do something they think is wrong, it may as well be wrong. It may as well be sin. But then Paul makes it very personal, and he enters into a long argument about his rights as an apostle. And this is quite interesting, and I don't have a slide for this particular part. It's a long list. You know, he starts off, am I not free? Going to chapter 9. Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus, our Lord? He goes into all these examples of his work, what he has done, his rights, his privileges as an apostle, as a leader. He talks about how when it comes to what he has done, and he talks about what he deserves, I suppose is the best way that you could talk about it. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Verse 7. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? Do I say this merely on human authority? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is out treading the grain. That's perfectly clear, isn't it? Surely, is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us, because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have then sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest for you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have all the more? In verse 12. But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hindering the gospel of Jesus. To Paul, let's go to verse 15. I've got it there on the screen. All right. So he says in verse 15, I have not used any of these rights. The rights that are owed somebody who has worked hard for the gospel, who has planted churches, who has made disciples. He's talking about the rights that he feels he is owed. I have not used any of these rights. And I am not writing this in the hope that you will reward me in any way, shape, or form, that you will do such things for me. For I would rather die pretty strong language, then allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. Okay, let's just pause right there. Paul is saying that I have all these rights and privileges owed to me. I'm an apostle, I've planted churches, I've made disciples. Look at what I and the Spirit through me has done. There's often this sort of dichotomy between, well, it wasn't me, it was the Spirit, or it wasn't me, it was just God. But I think we cannot discount the human element in all this. Yes, it is the Spirit working through Paul, but it's also Paul laying down the work. It is Paul going from place to place. It is Paul enduring hardship for the sake of the gospel. We cannot discount the fact that Paul is there, not just for the ride, but he's there doing the work, right? And he says, look, I have done the work, therefore, my rights, my privileges, don't I deserve a reward for the work that I have done? Now, in the ancient world, people like Paul, tent makers, were looked down upon because it was physical hard labor, especially in the Greco-Roman world, having gnarly hands, having a bent form from physical labor, it was something to be looked down upon. And yet Paul, from what we can see, received very little help personally from a lot of the churches that he founded. Rather than going into an area and trying to get money and funds off the various believers in the area, he would earn the money himself and then put it back into the ministry. He was not profiteering off these churches. And yet he says, I could, if I want to, not profiteer, not take them for a ride, but actually just take what is mine. It's my right as an apostle. If not me, then whom? And yet, the dichotomy here, the tension here, is he says, I don't want to do any of that. I don't want to be seen to be profiteering off the work of the Lord. I don't want to be seen to be profiting in any way, shape, or form off this ministry that I believe God has called me to. To Paul, preaching the gospel of Jesus is the most important thing in his life. In his hierarchy of priorities, declaring Jesus and him crucified sits at the very, very top. And he illustrates this in verses 19 through 23, where he talks about his flexibility when speaking to different ethnic groups. And this is the one that we are all very familiar with. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law. And he talks about to the Greeks as well. This is sort of like the crescendo of his argument. To whoever he interacts with, he relates, he is flexible, he fits his message and his methodology to be able to reach them most effectively, right? He's not so staunch in his cultural identity that he'll let even that get in the way of sharing the gospel. And whilst Paul doesn't directly apply his experience to that of the Corinthians, it almost seems like he's challenging them. It's almost like he's saying, are you so invested in your cultural heritage, your preferences and your traditions, that you will allow your ability to share the gospel be limited? And make no mistake, this would have been a scandalous idea to these early Christians. After all, culture and tradition in the ancient world was a fundamental identity marker for these people. The thought of abandoning my cultural point of view, my cultural lens, to achieve the higher ideal of declaring the gospel of Jesus would have been a very difficult pill to swallow. It's a good thing times have changed, right? No, not really. The same idea, I think, is the same idea that really, really challenges me, and I think challenges us in the 21st century. Not in the sense of my ethnic or my national heritage, but the lens through which I see life. The things that I take for granted as a Christian, as a member of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination, as a citizen or as a resident of New Zealand, as a person with very distinct political and social leanings, and just as a human being alive in the 21st century, each one of us possesses a set of cultural norms, a set of cultural lenses, a cultural point of view that we just take for granted. Well, that's just how life is. I used to really struggle with this as a teenager, seeing all the different controversies and conflicts around me. Arrogantly, I just thought, well, the way that I see the world is the correct way, so why doesn't everybody else see the world the way that I see it? You know, what an arrogant thing to think. And yet, most of us, in some way, shape, or form, even me still today, think that. The way that I see the world is the right way to see the world. And we just take these cultural norms, we take this cultural point of view for granted. You know, it might come out in what clothing is sort of acceptable to wear, you know, what music is okay and what music is not okay, what type of conversations are acceptable, what type of conversations are off limits, what issues are important, what issues do we relegate, we put to the sideline, they don't really matter. What language, you know, the idioms, the turns of phrase, what are commonplace, what ones don't we use? You know, when I first moved to New Zealand, the idea of going down to the dairy was a strange idea for me. I'd never heard that before. I thought that when people said, I'm just going to pop down to the dairy, that they were literally going down to a dairy farm. Or, you know, why would you go to a dairy farm to pick up lollies? Are you just going to find milk there? Even to say, you know, going in a wee little while, you know, that's something that I only associate with being Scottish. But of course, that is sort of how that came about in New Zealand. There are all these turns of phrase, these idioms, these languages that are we just take for granted, right? The list goes on and on and on. And I think the fundamental that we all need to question for ourselves is, am I so enamored, am I so wrapped up with my cultural framework, my cultural point of view, my cultural lens, that I cannot be flexible with it in order to reach people who are far from God? That's the fundamental question that you and I, all of us, have to grapple with. Have we fallen in love with our system, this framework that we have constructed of how we do church, how we do our spirituality, how we do life, that we'd much prefer to cling to it rather than flexibly using it to achieve its actual purpose, which is to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ to a hurting world? So, to bring us back to that original, second question, what are my rights as a Christian? I think if Paul was in the room, he'd say that's the wrong question to be asking. I think the real question that each one of us need to grapple with is, how much am I prepared to sacrifice in order to effectively share the gospel? And I'm not just simply talking about how much money, how much of my stuff, how much of my time. It's really how much of my comfort level, how much of my preconceived ideas, how much of my cultural framework am I prepared to be flexible with in order to effectively share the gospel? And I think that's something that we all need to recognize. And, you know, I think it's really interesting. Sometimes when we have this conversation, we often go into, well, that's just compromising. We're not going to compromise because if we compromise, well, then that's dishonoring to God. And I don't think compromising is really what we need to be doing because the message has never changed, right? It's always been Jesus. It's always been him crucified. It's always been him raised to life. And it's all about new life in him and expecting his soon return. That's the message. It's always been the message. And I think sometimes when when Christians grapple with issues in our society, whether it be the hot button issues, no, I'm going to go back. Oh no, Peter, I think I've gone on to the next one. Peter, can you stop it? I was trying to go forward, but I needed to go back. I mean, this is a lovely interlude. Let's take a little break and then we'll go back to it. Can I go back? I need some elevator music for this bit. All right, sweet. Thank you. All I wanted to do was go back to this particular slide. So when it comes to these sorts of issues, I think a lot of the times we as Christians have bought into a lie that the ends justify the means. When it comes to a lot of these issues, like, let's not, cut any. Let's be honest. These are very contentious issues, right? Would that be fair to say? Yeah. And these are issues that a lot of us have a lot of emotion about, and a lot of other people have a lot of emotion about. And I think when it comes to issues like these, the issues that divide us, we really have to grapple with the fact that the ends never justify the means. That when we are dealing with these issues, number one, we have a biblical mandate of what we believe, but we also have a biblical mandate for how we act and for the types of conversations that we have. And the way that we have those conversations, especially with people with whom we disagree. And I think this is the fundamental question that I want us to grapple with. As we come to the end, we're almost at the end, I want to talk about this for a moment, and then we're finished. When it comes to issues, what do? Well, sometimes we do one of two things. We behave like an ostrich, or we behave like a plover. Many of us know that ostriches are famous for putting their heads in the ground, and there's a myth that is to sort of protect them from predators, that they think that by doing that the predators can't see them. That's not true. That is a myth. They do it because they bury their eggs in the ground, and when they put their heads in the ground, it's to check on their eggs. All right. So regardless of that, this idea of burying your head in the sand has become synonymous with the idea and the image of the ostrich. And so what a lot of us do sometimes when it comes to some of these contentious issues is we just bury our heads in the sand, we change the subject, we pretend it's not there, and we just we want everybody to just get along. And so we just don't talk about it, right? I know I've been guilty of that at times. Avoidance is never healthy. My therapist told me that, because it never actually solves anybody's problem. Avoiding the problem just defers it to a later time. But neither is acting like a plover. Now, I'm sure some people think that this is a beautiful bird. I've yet to meet anybody, but I'm sure they're out there. If you've ever encountered a plover before that's nesting, oh my goodness, right? That is a sight and a sound to behold. A few years ago, I had a plover family move into my front yard, and my goodness, did I know they were there. Every single day of every single week while they were nesting, every time I went outside the house, I had to take an umbrella with me because they were so vicious. And the sound is just so grating all the time. It's terrible. Now, one of the other things that we do, and there are people in my life like this, is when we get passionate about an issue, we act like a plover. We can never shut up about it. I'm sorry, but there are people in my life, perhaps there are people in your life like that as well. They just can't stop going on and on and on about it. And I don't think that's healthy either. So when I think about this, when I think about the way that we should act, I don't think we should be an ostrich. I don't think we should be an avoider, but I don't think we should be a plover either. We shouldn't pretend like the issues aren't there, but we also shouldn't go on and on about them until everybody around you wishes you would just shut it. I think our engagement with the issues does matter. I think we should engage with these issues, but I think the way that we engage them is most important. After all, Jesus does tell us that the way people will know that we belong to him is the way that we love each other. And to say that it boils down to love just might seem a little reductionistic, but I do firmly believe there's no getting around that. I think the true test of a life lived through the lens of love, alliteration not intentional, isn't dealing with just the simple issues, but in those that challenge and stretch us. This is not a call to conform to society's standards. It's not a call to change your convictions or anything like that, but rather I think what Paul is inviting us to do here is to stand for what we believe in, but not allow the most important thing to get in the way. Paul could have acted according to his rights. He could have demanded financial, physical support from these churches, but he decided, you know what? I'm not going to allow any of these rights that I have to get in the way of what I believe is most important, and that is to spread the gospel of Jesus. When we stand up for what we believe, but allow our words and actions to be filtered through the fruit of the Holy Spirit, that's when people will see we're the real deal. And when we engage with culture in a thoughtful, compassionate, and graceful way, that's when people will see that it's not us, but rather Jesus working through us. Because at the end of the day, I think that's what we all want, and that's what we all desire. Not to have our voices heard necessarily, not to have our opinions shared, but to be a conduit, a vessel to be used by the Lord, pointing people to Jesus, pointing people to the cross. Amen? Amen. Do we have a final song, Peter? Awesome. Thank you.